So if you're new around here, I don't know why you would pick this one to start with, but I do want to give you a little heads up that this shit's super fucked up. So this is your one and only trigger warning for crimes against children, including sexual abuse. So please don't continue listening if you're going to end up taking your sweet time to write me a nasty email about it. Please and thank you. We're going to pick it right back up again when Joseph Duncan has skipped town in Minnesota on bail, thanks to one of his many sugar daddies. He's making his way through the Pacific Northwest just after securing a now stolen Jeep, everything he needs to commit the perfect crime, in his opinion, and a bone to pick with society that just doesn't stop. Here we go. A little interesting bit I found here, there's actually a Reddit story from a poster named Julia Katrina 0507 that wrote about how she thinks Joseph Duncan was spying on her and her sisters while on this road trip when he was seeking out potential children to abduct. She says that when she was having a sleepover in her Missoula, Montana home, she saw what she had initially thought was a deer walking on her property until she notices that as it got closer to the downstairs bedroom window that's level with the ground, that this deer actually had these green eyes or green reflections, which she now realizes was the reflection of Duncan's signature night vision creep sessions. When they started screaming, he took off, and the news of the GPS device that was recovered from Duncan after his arrest, it shows several points of interest in what police believe this could actually be very possible. Super spook, am I right? So after Montana, he's driving along I-90 where he's almost to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, but he stops off at a lodge to stake out both children and possible camping areas. That's when he notices 8-year-old Shasta and her mom, 40-year-old Brenda, sunbathing on their family home front deck. Their property is located to a closed campground area next to the lodge that he stops at. It's on a rather large plot of land that even has a creek running through the back of it. He drives by one more time to get a closer look at the two, but not to raise any more suspicion, as he might have just found exactly what he's looking for. He notes they do live somewhat secluded, being that there's just one neighbor, but they have a rather large field between them, as well as the closed-down campground property on the other side of the family lot. He notes the location in the GPS system he's been traveling with, and then heads off to Spokane, which is about 45 minutes away. He says he uses the Wi-Fi that was available from a coffee shop in the city's South Hill area, and that's where he notices a young mom and her son in the front of their duplex building, conveniently posting that it was available to rent. Duncan makes one final, rather menacing blog post on May 14th, 2005, and then proceeds to walk down the alley and act like a prospective renter for this duplex. Joseph explains that initially he had noticed the shirtless boy playing with the rent sign, so as this mom's showing him around the place, she catches Joseph staring at her little guy, which he notices her noticing him, and thinks that if he seems like as if he's just staring off into space rather than actually like focusing on our kid, she will become less suspicious, which is exactly what happened, I guess. He literally watched the suspicion melt off her face, rather solidifying his assumptions, and he then decides to head back over to Idaho and catch up on some sleep before he spends his evening staking out the Groney home. So first, Duncan says that he approached their home rather directly because he knew he wouldn't be easily seen considering how big the property is, and also it's like 2 a.m. He walks right up to their trailer home deck, noting the heavy-duty dog chains and food bowls, meaning that they have some large dogs probably inside the home. He noticed a sticker on their front screen door reading, "Intruders will be shot," which to him, he says, could have just as easily said "welcome." He goes over to the bedroom window that's just covered in some heavy plastic at the moment, and then he peers through it. He sees the 2 children sleeping peacefully in their bed, and that's when he says a dog must have smelled him because their rather large dog suddenly walks into their room and stared right at him. He says it wasn't until he blinked that the dog started barking, so he retreats back to the bushes and waits until things chill out again. He then decides to go back to the Jeep, and he posts up on the hillside directly across the interstate from their property. He covers himself up with a camouflage tarp and uses his binoculars to note down what he sees. When the sun rises, he finds the home has 2 young kids, 1 teenager, their mom, and a man who is assumed to be her husband. He says he can tell they feel rather safe and comfortable in their very public front yard by the way that they enter and exit the house, as if the front deck is just another room of their home. He notes the parents are bickering. He sees another couple stop by and visit and decides he's seen enough, and then drives out into the public forest roads nearby, finding a nice secluded spot to rest up and mentally prepare for what he's about to do. He naps, then spends a few hours yelling and having arguments with God, as he put it. He waits until dark to creep into the closed campground and replaces the chain on the driveway with a prepped zip tie that he had packed. He parks along the backside of their property and continues to walk his way across the creek and the rougher terrain with his night vision goggles. He's wearing gloves, he has purchased thrifted shoes that are a few sizes too big to throw off authorities. He's prepared a few zip ties in handcuff style and pre-wiped them down along with the bullets he's loaded into the short-barreled 12-gauge shotgun he's carrying. The chamber bullets, he said, were filled with birdshot for the initial submission of the dogs because he said he didn't want to kill them, and then the other bullets were actually slugs for the parents if they were to resist his attempts in taking the children in any way. So, he says to himself that if their back door is locked, that he will take it as a sign from God that he should abort this self-righteous crime spree against society. And he'll just walk away and that'll be it. Nobody will die, it'll all be good. However, their back door's lock on the doorknob had apparently been broken for months, and he basically felt welcomed into their home when it quietly and easily allowed himself to come inside. Like a fucking vampire, this guy. While creeping around their home, he finds Brenda's fallen asleep on the living room couch with the lamp on, so he walks by her looking for the man of the house first. He's in the hallway when the dogs run up on him, though at the mere sight of his shotgun, they just cower and run back into a bedroom. The ruckus of the dogs had apparently woken Brenda up because he can see her trying to adjust her eyes to see him. So she turns off the light, and he makes his move, makes a beeline straight while showing her the gun, asking her where her husband is. She's like half awake, dazed, and possibly a little high from some weed and meth that she indulged in earlier in the night. And I'm only saying that because they found it in the autopsy reports. So Joseph clarifies, where's the man? Because he realizes that maybe she's so confused because they aren't actually married. And it turns out that they were just dating for like 7 years. She tells him the man's upstairs, so he orders her up there very sternly. He follows her up the stairs to a sleeping 37-year-old Mark McKenzie. Brenda goes to wake Mark up, and while he's half asleep and groggy, or also possibly still a little high, Brenda tells him, get up, man here with a gun, kind of like gesturing towards the hallway where Joseph is standing. Mark begins to sit up while Joseph tells Brenda to apply the 2 zip tie handcuffs he had prepped to both his ankles and his hands, then orders them back downstairs. Mark struggles to scoot down the staircase with his hands and his feet bound, but he's really just trying to lure Joseph away from his stash of personal guns and rifles that are in the room next to them. So Joseph has them in the living room where he then tells Brenda to call for the children to come out. Her oldest, 13-year-old Slade, talks back at first, because it is like 2 in the morning or some shit, on a Sunday, and then she yells at him to listen when he actually sees Duncan standing there by his mom with a gun. So Joseph makes Brenda bind Slade's hands, then calls the 2 younger children into the living room. Joseph then secures Brenda and the 2 younger children, though now he has run out of zip ties, so he has to use his duct tape. He has them all laid down on the floor, and as he takes Slade into the back door out of earshot of the family, he then strikes this poor boy on the top of the head with a framing hammer, which in Joseph's opinion would have been the quietest, fastest way of killing the person who stood in the way of him making off with these kids. He leaves Slade in the grass, presumably dead, when he goes to transfer first Shasta to Mark's truck, which he had offered when Joseph gave them the impression that he was just going to rob them. He tells 8-year-old Shasta to stay laying down in the truck when he goes back into the house to retrieve Dylan, her 9-year-old brother. When he returns to the truck with Dylan, Joseph sees Shasta sitting up and not following his orders, so he reiterates that he's going to hit her with his hammer if she doesn't stay down, and he leaves the children and goes back inside to deal with the parents. So Joseph takes Brenda into the kitchen, but her feet are bound and she ends up falling on her shoulder. And that's when Joseph strikes her many times in the head with the hammer to ensure that she's dead and not suffering. He continues on to Mark, Brenda's longtime boyfriend, and hits him as hard as he can because his thoughts are he's much bigger and probably requires more effort to kill without leaving him to suffer. So he walks around the rest of the home and checks that everything's clear, and then he notices Dylan and Shasta are both sitting up in the truck looking in the direction of the bushes. That's when he realizes that Slade, their 13-year-old brother, wasn't actually dead when he left him in the backyard. He was attempting to get the kids out of Mark's truck and untie him so they could all escape. But when Slade sees Joseph return to the truck, Slade is absolutely terrified and he can't move. He orders Shasta and Dylan to lay down again and makes one more swift move with the hammer and again strikes Slade one more time, ensuring he is dead or will die shortly. He then drives Mark's truck to the area behind the neighbor's barn, which he had concealed his Jeep. He transfers the kids over and then takes off east on Interstate 90 with these 2 terrified children in his possession. As it turns out, Slade was one tough kid because even after being attacked twice, he managed to get up from the bushes, attempted to go into the house, but the front door was locked, so he went around through the back and got inside the home. He must have checked around for Shasta and Dylan, but ends up covering his mother with a blanket from his room and is found lying next to her when police find them. Mark McKenzie also wasn't dead when Joseph left. He notes on his blog that it appears that he must have tried to get up, but accidentally fell back down and broke the table per the crime scene photos that he was shown during the trial. So police are notified in the evening hours the next day, Monday, May 16th, 2005, when the neighbor of the family calls because he had gone over there to pay Slade for mowing the field the day before, but after seeing Mark's truck behind his barn with the doors left open, and he notices a smear of blood on the front door and that no one will answer the door but the dogs are inside barking like crazy, he decided to call 911. A cop comes out and sees the blood on the door, so he goes around to the back of the house, so he notices the back door has been left open and has more blood smeared on that door. He appears inside and he sees Brenda laying on the floor in the kitchen, face down. He steps back out of the home to call for backup and he waits for someone else to arrive so they can further investigate the home. When they enter, they find the body of Slade next to his mom laying in the living room, near Mark's body as well. They notice there's blood strewn all throughout the house, even on the beds of the 2 children for which they cannot account for. They begin securing the scene and start to search the property of the home, hoping that the younger children may have escaped the attack and are just hiding out in the woods. When they aren't found, they begin notifying next of kin to the family when they realize that the man in the house is not the missing children's father, but in fact, their real father was unaware that they were missing or that his ex-wife and their current boyfriend had been killed. After ensuring that their biological father, Steve, doesn't have the kids and has nothing to do with this, a somewhat delayed Amber Alert was issued to the missing kids. Some of the surrounding states of Idaho don't initially alert their systems as they don't find the scenario meets criteria that allows for the Amber Alert to be broadcasted, though it's eventually picked up in the next couple days. While police are investigating any leads that they can come up with to track down the children's whereabouts, they receive the results of Brenda and Mike's autopsies. They discover that the weapon used was a framing hammer and not a gun as they first suspected. Detectives end up assuming this attack is personal based on the level of force used with Mark, which was not Joseph's thinking. It might have actually helped leads for possible motives of these attacks draw attention away from Joseph's trail and was really just like a bonus, I guess, for him. They also find the small amounts of marijuana and meth in their toxicology reports, and that indicates at least a level of recreational abuse, and both of those substances are still illegal in the state of Idaho. So detectives begin considering leads that connect to a possible drug-related incident, or per tips from the public, they begin looking into claims that it was possibly like a biker gang hit when considering the family's history with gangs and the fact that their 2 oldest sons have a somewhat criminal background. Shasta, Slade, and Dylan have 2 older brothers that have a little bit of a shady background. Even one of those older brothers mentions that a particular man that was in their home the same night that they were presumably killed actually owed Brenda $2,000. But they have not considered the idea that someone may have possibly just murdered these 3 people solely for the purpose of abducting kids, because that is psychotic shit. Joseph has these children so isolated in the Lolo National Forests of Montana that it wouldn't be weeks until they're seen again. Joseph would abuse these children in every possible manner in a non-official camping spot at the end of a very long, rough logging road outside of St. Regis, Montana. He would tell them graphically of how he murdered their parents and even other children like them. He physically beat Dylan more often than her, according to Shasta's interviews with investigators. They were found to be sexually abused and even tortured during what I can imagine is those children's worst experiences of their life. Shasta told investigators that Joseph would chain her brother and her up if he wanted to leave the campsite, and at some point during the trip, he relocates them to an old abandoned cabin for a day when he videotapes himself sexually torturing 9-year-old Dylan. He goes on to say that Joseph was hella more physical with Dylan, much more than herself, leaving Dylan to start losing hope that he would probably not make it out of this nightmare alive. Even though she's the younger sister by just a year, they are really close, and she starts being the stronger one and encourages him to hold out just a little longer. In the meantime, she sort of befriends Joseph in a way, despite the daily abuse they're enduring. She manages to learn about his life before the camping trip, about his family, and all his personal interests. Not even a week after the cabin video, as it's known now, is made, Dylan is sent back to heaven and free from any more acts of torture and pain from Joseph Duncan. Shasta recalls that while she's on one side of the Jeep Cherokee, she hears Joseph's shotgun fire off. She runs around the Jeep to find Joseph now holding the gun, and her brother Dylan is on the ground screaming in pain with a wound in his stomach area. She says she witnesses Joseph then hold the barrel of the gun next to Dylan's head while he's begging for his life when the fucking shotgun clicks and doesn't fire. This evil fucking man then reloads the shotgun while both Shasta and Dylan are watching in horror as he then refires and kills Dylan instantly. He immediately starts crying and freaking out and telling Shasta that it was really just an accident and he had only had to kill him. And he only killed him so he wouldn't suffer anymore. So at this point, Shasta is fucking distraught and she disassociates and doesn't say a word to Joseph for the next few days. After those long few silent days, Shasta says that Joseph asks her what way she wanted to die. Does she want to be shot like her brother? It'll hurt, but it'll be faster, or he can strangle her, which will hurt, but take longer. Her little 8-year-old mind literally thinks it over, and she reasons that she might be able to talk him out of it if she chooses being strangled. So he begins to tie this rope around her throat and starts pulling as she starts begging him not to continue. It's not until she actually says his nickname Jet, which he told them was his name, that he stops choking her and suddenly has a change of heart. It's July 2nd, 2005, nearly 7 weeks of chaos for this poor girl, when, for whatever fucking reason, Joseph decides to take Shasta into a Denny's, a 24-hour diner in her hometown, at 2 in the goddamn morning. He absolutely knew what was going to happen too. First, the waitress begins to notice this very odd dynamic in the relationship between Joseph and Shasta. This little girl won't even order a milkshake without looking at Duncan for permission to speak. This really creeps the waitress out, and she starts realizing that the girl looks a lot like the missing child posted all around the town. She has a quick little huddle with her manager and coworker, and when other customers of the restaurant are starting to recognize Shasta as well, they call the police and begin to position themselves to deter Joseph from leaving with Shasta again, as nonchalantly as they can.
I had a little girl here with a tall gentleman, and she looks so much like that Shasta.
Okay, are they still in the building?
And we're not sure. You know, she looks so much like her, and I don't know.
All right, we'll have someone start that way.
When a police officer pulls into the parking lot with his lights off, the waitress that had been helping Joseph and Shasta runs out and tells him that he's going to need to call for more backup, which they do. When he enters the building, he sees Joseph whisper something into Shasta's ear when he walks straight towards Shasta and asks her what her name is. When she replies, Shasta Grony, and starts crying, the officer calmly tells Joseph to stand up and places him under arrest. He tells the waitress to stay with Shasta while he then puts Joseph in the squad car without any resistance at all. The waitress then asks Shasta where Dylan is, hoping that he's maybe in the car outside. But that's when Shasta tells the woman that Dylan's in heaven with her mom and her brother. She said that Jet was bringing her back to her dad because he changed his mind about killing her too, and that she taught him how to love again. Joseph even admits to having a bit of an epiphany regarding his own contribution to the nasty cycle of the criminal versus society issue, and that if something doesn't stop, it'll never end. He sees the purity in the fact that Shasta is immediately able to forgive him for attempting to strangle her by saying yes to still wanting to meet his mom even after he tries to kill her. If everyone could be more forgiving like kids, maybe the cycle can end, per se. Whatever thoughts and feelings truly made him bring her back to Coeur d'Alene is honestly irrelevant, because I think we can all agree that that wasn't just a stupid mistake on his part, but more so like a clear sign of a change in the frame of his mind, because he did not have to go back there, but he did, and it's amazing if nothing else. Shasta is immediately taken to the Kootenai County Medical Center to be evaluated while her father is notified of her safe recovery. Steve was actually a ways away in Tacoma visiting family for Independence Day weekend. He wasn't able to get any immediate flights home, so he drove for like 7 hours straight to the hospital from Tacoma to see his daughter, though he's still very upset that they haven't yet found Dylan, which is obviously sort of a terrible sign to everybody. Upon his arrest, none of the authorities had ever heard of Joseph Duncan. Though he was a federal fugitive on the run by that point, they didn't realize the true extent of somewhat long and seemingly violent history. They start wondering how the fuck someone like this has been able to pull off the most vicious murder case the state of Idaho has ever fucking seen. After taking what Shasta has said about where they might have been from when Joseph showed her a map, on top of a witness account from a gas station claiming to remember a man described as Joseph buying a case of beer and asking about good camping spots nearby, it was 2 days after Shasta's recovery on July 4th, 2005, when park rangers uncover a makeshift camping spot at the very end of that closed logging road. There, they recovered small charred bone fragments of what appeared to be human remains spread throughout the camping area. They need to send them off to Quantico for DNA analysis, though it's presumed they are the remains of 9-year-old Dylan Groney. And their hometown community would hold a public birthday memorial for what would have been Dylan's 10th birthday 2 weeks later. Just a week after Joseph Duncan's arrest, they charge him with 3 counts of both first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder in the names of Brenda Groney, Slade Groney, and Mark McKenzie. Dylan and Shasta's justice were to be determined by the federal courts since Joseph had crossed state lines with minors for the purposes of sexual exploitation. The family of Mark McKenzie actually went out to sue the Minnesota county that had allowed Joseph's release upon such a low bail amount for someone with his violent criminal history. I couldn't find whether or not this was awarded at all, though I did read a stipulation in the lawsuit that requested Joseph Duncan never receive any profits from future books or documentary deals regarding this case. The county in Minnesota explained that there was a misunderstanding at Duncan's bail hearing at the time when the judge who ordered the low bail amount didn't hear the part at which Joseph Duncan was a level 3 sexual offender, which would have incurred a higher amount than he actually received. So it's pretty much just a stupid mistake, and I'm pretty sure they probably awarded it to the family. The trial for this case would ultimately be delayed 3 times per his defense attorney's varied requests for more time, as well as additional hearings of mental competency, when Joseph actually had decided to dismiss his own counsel and represent himself. Joseph Duncan will plead guilty to the charges on Brenda, Mark, and Slade, with the agreement that he received 3 consecutive life sentences for each of their bound kidnappings and sequential murders. It's strategically maneuvered by prosecutors that the federal jury will actually decide whether Joseph Duncan will receive a death sentence or life in prison without parole, so the state doesn't even waste their time pursuing their own death sentence. Joseph is next indicted by a federal grand jury on 10 counts of kidnapping, kidnapping resulting in death, aggravated sexual abuse of a minor, sexual exploitation of a child resulting in death, and other crimes including illegal possession of a firearm as well as vehicle theft. After uncovering Joseph Duncan's GPS system, they backtracked all his travels all over the United States, notifying the public in certain areas to come forward with any information. Bloggers from Riverside County, where Joseph had murdered the 10-year-old Anthony Martinez, point out a connection to similarities in their composite sketch to Duncan, as well as fitting into a timeline for his murder. Authorities take the opportunities to verify Duncan's prints to a partial handprint they found on the duct tape used in Martinez's murder. So he's then charged, in addition to the indicted counts, that he will also face another murder charge from California prosecutors. And while being investigated for those crimes, Joseph admits to detectives that he's also murdered 2 young girls from Seattle, whom he could not recall their names. However, they were able to link it back to those unsolved homicides of 11-year-old Sammy Jo White and her half-sister 9-year-old Carmen Cubayas. Though he has confessed to their murder, he was not officially charged, and their family has not yet received justice. During Joseph Duncan's trial, it was agreed that Shasta would not have to testify, so Duncan wouldn't be able to cross-examine her since he was representing himself in court. It was also stipulated that Joseph would release passwords to his computer that they recovered from the Cherokee. They told him that it would take them 30 years to crack the encryption code he had on it, which he obviously loved hearing. The actual video Duncan recorded while in the abandoned cabin with Dylan was to be shown in trial, which infuriated Steve Groney, Dylan's father. He asked everyone in the courtroom to only be present for its showing if necessary for the trial, and anyone who wasn't absolutely essential to the jury should be charged with child pornography or something like that. I don't blame the man, honestly. It was described by jurors as the most disgusting, haunting piece of evidence they have ever imagined having to deal with. Duncan can be heard yelling at Dylan while he's inflicting his torture. The devil is here, boy, the devil himself, and the devil likes to watch children suffer and cry. Experts in court found that Joseph's claims to Shasta about accidentally shooting Dylan would have been nearly impossible to do. He explains he was digging around in a plastic box that had random things when he's looking for a can of beer. He says the shotgun accidentally fired, but he must have forced something else in the box to move the trigger enough to fire it off. Experts in court argued that it would have taken at least 5 pounds of constant pressure for that shotgun to have been fired. Of course, the jurors would be offered counseling upon their deliberation and recommendations of the death penalty. And the state ended up even increasing the amount of money that is allocated to therapy and rehab needs for the victims of crimes such as these. Finally, he's sentenced to 3 death penalties for the crimes of Dylan and Shasta Groney alone. Though he actually pleads guilty to his 10 federal charges initially, he would get an automatic appeal for his death sentence, but then he had additional petitions to appeal the original judge's decision to allow him to waive his representation. The lone survivor of the Groney murders, Shasta, would then be rallied around by her hometown community from then on. They started a trust fund in her name, as well as began the foundation and groundbreaking for a home that they entrusted to her until she's the age of 25. She even used all her newfound attention at the time to host a fundraiser for the local animal shelter in her area. She would later go on to enact a petition called Dylan and Slade's Law, which would reduce the amount of strikes essentially that sexual offenders could receive. She was asking for it to be lowered from 3 strikes to 1 strike. Later, after a few attempts to extradite Joseph to California for the murder charges of Anthony Martinez, one petition being from Arnold Schwarzenegger himself, as he was the governor at the time, Joseph is finally brought to California and he pleads guilty and is then given to 2 additional life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murder of Anthony Martinez. So Joseph is now incarcerated at the Terre Haute Federal Correctional Complex in the state of Indiana, where America holds some of their most violent offenders, where he begins now blogging about his accounts of the crimes. In 2018, Shasta's father, Steve, publicly posted that he received an eviction notice for the house that they built for Shasta. She was no longer living with her father there, but she also wasn't 25 yet. They ended up selling the house to further finance her trust fund needs for the remaining time that she had it. She moves to Boise, and after having a little trouble with the law on her own accord and receiving a year in a rehab facility, Shasta does a television interview about her life at the time. She's expecting her first child and expresses gratitude that she's still able to conceive children despite the trauma she had incurred because of Joseph Duncan. She even talks about a future book in the works and possibly going to visit Joseph Duncan in jail for a documentary. She explains that he had asked her to come visit him, and that's what he had whispered in her ear just moments before he was arrested. I've been waiting for news on a book release. However, after getting on the Kickstarter page that was raising money for Shasta and a co-author to produce that book, I've since found that those who backed more than like $16,000 are now requesting refunds for never actually receiving the product. I'm honestly not sure about this, but it might have something to do with the fact that shortly after being interviewed on TV, Duncan had posted on his blog the horrifyingly detailed account of her family's murder. Obviously, I will forever support anything that amazing little girl does, and regardless of my own personal knowledge of the case, I would absolutely love to read her own personal account of the events that occurred in those 7 weeks of hell. But honestly, fuck Joseph for telling everybody what really happened. People like me remembered Shasta's case when she showed back up in the local news later in 2018 after being reported to be missing and endangered with her young children, though she was found the very next day and it was said to be a misunderstanding. Steve Groney, Shasta's father, had finally succumbed to a long battle of lung cancer, which he had been fighting during most of Duncan's trial. He was able to witness Shasta get married, though, before he passed away, which Shasta says she's very grateful for. He also said that he was excited to see Slade and Dylan in heaven. And that just warms my little heart. Honestly, it took a lot of talking myself into reading Joseph Duncan's blog entries that he had posted since his final incarceration. I found a link to his newest version with diary entries dating back from 2010, clear up to this year actually. He is very blunt and seemingly honest, so when he warns you that what you're about to read, someone like me who reads crazy shit all the time, I got a little spooked. You never get perspective like that. I was weighing the possibilities of mentally scarring myself and making the most up-to-date, accurate account of this serial killer for you guys. Truthfully, after reading 99% of it, I understand a little better about where this guy is or was at mentally. I'm possibly falling into the most fucked up person's mental games, I suppose. But my point is that his entries, though they're somewhat disorganized, are much more thoughtfully written now that he has seemed to work out some of those major demons that he was struggling at versus the blog entries that he made prior to these Groney murders. I kind of see him like a rather naive boy misunderstanding the actions he's been caught doing, but others taught him and weren't caught. Then he's categorized as untreatable due to his misunderstanding of sex and sex crimes and sexual curiosity due to his age. He's denied actual productive help multiple times due to the politics and the personal agenda of a few too many powerful people. He only really learns about sex, and forcibly so, in a prison environment, and then becomes angry when he realizes his crimes were exaggerated and a result of lack of resources to healthy sexual experimentation, and that he's stuck in prison 3 times longer than he was initially told. He's started a long period of resentment towards a society that supports the system that is failing to help him, and further condemning him. And I'm not at all excusing this behavior. He's quite literally one of the worst people I've ever lived. But my point is that by him being honest in these blog entries and confessing and explaining these thoughts and feelings, he can point out to those willing to listen anyways, the damning circle that's created him yet saved him. By condemning him to be a bad person, he became a bad person, but now also understands that if something doesn't change, the cycle will continue. He encourages that if we, society, treat those acting out, criminals, with actual therapeutic resources and understanding, and not just life sentences, then we can stop recreating the very same criminals that are continuing to hurt us. I see his point. I don't know if it'll work, but it's definitely more positive than I would have expected from someone like this, from just all the things you read in the newspaper, which is mainly why he's posting now, and to clarify the reasons for being the person that he is, basically. I gotta thank you so much for hanging in there with me on this one. I know it was long and hard on the feelers. The story was much more fulfilling to do than I had expected because I did not realize I would get such a detailed source of information. I know more than I almost ever wanted to know, but I have been somewhat enlightened in a way to what truly contributes in creating a killer, I suppose, and how we might just be able to stop that vicious cycle. But for now, I'm just going to remind you, always go lock your damn doors, because failing to do so might as well be a welcome wagon for some psycho like Joseph Duncan III. He's climbing in your windows, he's snatching your people up, trying to rape them, so y'all need to hide your kids, hide your wife, and hide your husband, because they're raping everybody out here. Good night.